The People's Temple, the Jonestown Massacre. Picture this, November 18, 1978. A congressman lies dead on a remote airstrip in Guyana, gunned down while investigating reports of abuse. Miles away in a jungle compound called Jonestown, over 900 Americans are about to die in what would become the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. And it all started with a charismatic preacher in Indianapolis who promised racial equality and a socialist utopia. Jim Jones founded the People's Temple in 1955, initially attracting followers with his integrated congregation and progressive messages against racism. This wasn't your typical fire and brimstone preacher. Jones preached apostolic socialism, promising followers that religion was the opiate of the masses and that true enlightenment came through his brand of socialism. By the 1960s, he'd moved his growing flock to Northern California, eventually settling in San Francisco where his political connections grew powerful enough to influence local elections. But behind the facade of social justice lurked something far more sinister. Jones was addicted to amphetamines, paranoid about government persecution, and increasingly convinced that nuclear war was imminent. He demanded absolute loyalty from his followers, who called him Dad, and eventually Father. Those who questioned him faced public humiliation, beatings, and psychological torture. Jones recorded everything, creating an audio diary of madness that would later provide chilling evidence of his descent into megalomania. The move to Guyana in 1977 was sold as an escape to a tropical paradise where they could build their socialist dream. Instead, Jonestown became a prison camp. Armed guards prevented escape. Children were separated from parents. Followers worked grueling hours in the jungle heat while Jones, high on drugs and drunk on power, ranted through loudspeakers about enemies plotting their destruction. The end came when Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate. Some followers begged to leave with him. Jones saw this as the ultimate betrayal. As Ryan's group prepared to depart from the nearby airstrip, Jones's gunmen opened fire, killing Ryan and 4 others. Back at Jonestown, Jones initiated what he called revolutionary suicide. Parents were forced to squirt cyanide-laced flavor aid into their children's mouths. Those who refused were held down and injected. Jones himself died from a gunshot to the head, likely suicide. The final death toll, 918 people, including 304 children. It wasn't suicide, it was mass murder orchestrated by a madman who convinced hundreds of decent people that dying together was their only escape from persecution. Audio recordings from that final day capture the screams of children, the protests of mothers, and Jones's calm voice urging them all to die with dignity. The phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, entered American vocabulary, though it was actually flavor aid that carried the poison that killed nearly 1,000 souls in the Guyanese jungle. NXIVM, the self-help sex cult. In 2018, America watched in shock as Hollywood actresses, billionaire heiresses, and successful businesswomen were revealed as victims of a sophisticated sex trafficking operation masquerading as executive coaching. NXIVM looked like any other self-improvement company, complete with corporate headquarters, celebrity endorsements, and expensive seminars promising to unlock human potential. But beneath its polished exterior lay one of the most manipulative and depraved cults of the 21st century. Keith Raniere founded NXIVM in 1998, positioning himself as a brilliant philosopher-scientist who could teach people to overcome their psychological limitations. Students paid thousands to attend intensive workshops filled with pseudo-psychological jargon and exercises designed to break down their defenses. Raniere, who insisted followers call him Vanguard, claimed to be one of the world's smartest men with an IQ of 240. In reality, he was a convicted pyramid scheme operator with a history of targeting vulnerable women. The horror of NXIVM lay in its secret inner circle called DOS, an acronym that supposedly stood for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, Latin for Lord/Master of the Obedient Female Companions. DOS members were told it was an empowerment group for women, but it was actually Raniere's personal harem. Women were branded with symbols that incorporated Raniere's initials, forced to provide compromising photos and information as collateral, and coerced into sexual relationships with him. The branding ceremonies were particularly brutal. Women were stripped naked, held down by other members, and had Ranieri's initials seared into their flesh with a cauterizing pen. They were told the pain was necessary for growth and that the symbols represented the elements. Only later did victims realize they'd been permanently marked as Ranieri's property. The branding was just the beginning. DOS members were starved to maintain specific weights, required to ask permission for basic activities, and forced to recruit new slaves into the system. What made NXIVM especially insidious was how it attracted successful, intelligent women who thought they were joining an empowerment organization. Actress Allison Mack, known for playing Chloe Sullivan on Smallville, became one of Ranieri's top recruiters and was later convicted as his co-conspirator. Claire Bronfman, heiress to the Seagram fortune, bankrolled the organization with over $100 million and used her wealth to fund Ranieri's legal battles against critics and defectors. The cult finally crumbled in 2017 when former members went public with their stories. The New York Times expose revealed the branding, sexual slavery, and psychological manipulation that defined DOS. Within months, Ranieri was arrested in Mexico, where he'd been hiding in a luxury villa. In 2019, a federal jury convicted him on all charges including racketeering, sex trafficking, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the man who claimed to be saving humanity. NXIVM's downfall sent shockwaves through American society because it demonstrated how easily educated, successful people could be manipulated by a charismatic sociopath. It wasn't a backwoods religious sect but a sophisticated operation that targeted society's elite, proving that intelligence and success offer no protection against cult manipulation. The Manson family, helter-skelter. The summer of 1969 shattered America's innocence forever. In the hills of Los Angeles, a group of young people high on drugs and devotion to a failed musician named Charles Manson committed murders so brutal they shocked even hardened detectives. The Tate LaBianca murders weren't just crimes, they were ritualistic slaughters designed to trigger a race war that Manson called Helter Skelter, named after a Beatles song he believed contained coded messages about the coming apocalypse. Charles Manson was a career criminal who spent most of his adult life in prison before arriving in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district in 1967, just as the summer of love was reaching its peak. Short, charismatic, and filled with rage, Manson quickly attracted a following of young runaways, mostly women from middle-class backgrounds seeking meaning in the counterculture movement. He preached a twisted philosophy mixing Christianity, Scientology, and racial apocalypticism, all while maintaining control through LSD, sex, and psychological manipulation. Manson convinced his followers that he was Jesus Christ reincarnated and that the Beatles' White Album contained prophecies about an impending race war. According to Manson's delusional worldview, Black Americans would rise up and kill all whites except for his family, who would hide in a bottomless pit in Death Valley. After the blacks destroyed civilization, they would turn to Manson to lead them because whites were naturally superior leaders. It was insane, racist nonsense, but to young people severed from reality by drugs and manipulation, it seemed profound. The murders began on August 9, 1969, when Manson sent 4 followers to 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon. The target was Terry Melcher, a record producer who had previously refused to give Manson a recording contract. But Melcher no longer lived there. Instead, the killers found actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, along with 4 friends. What followed was a savage attack that left all 5 victims dead, stabbed dozens of times, with the word "pig" written in blood on the front door. The next night, Manson personally led a group to the LaBianca house, where they tortured and killed Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. The killers carved war into Leno's stomach and left messages like "Death to Pigs" and "Helter Skelter," misspelled, written in blood on the walls. The randomness and brutality of the crimes terrorized Los Angeles, with residents installing security systems and buying guns to protect themselves from what seemed like senseless violence. The breakthrough came when Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers, bragged about the murders to cellmates while jailed on unrelated charges. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of Manson's control over his family. These weren't hardened criminals but middle-class kids who'd been psychologically destroyed and rebuilt in Manson's image. At trial, the female defendants shaved their heads, carved X's into their foreheads, and disrupted proceedings while maintaining their devotion to their leader. Manson's conviction for first-degree murder and conspiracy marked the end of the 1960s idealistic dream of peace and love. The man who wanted to start a race war instead exposed the dark potential of charismatic manipulation and the vulnerability of young people seeking belonging and purpose. His crimes remain a chilling reminder that evil often hides behind messages of love and acceptance. Aum Shinrikyo, the Doomsday Chemical Cult. March 20, 1995. Rush hour in Tokyo. Thousands of commuters packed into subway trains, heading to work in one of the world's safest cities. Then the unthinkable happened. 5 men carrying plastic bags filled with liquid sarin nerve gas punctured the containers and fled, leaving behind a weapon of mass destruction that would kill 13 people, seriously injure 50 more, and cause vision problems for thousands. This wasn't international terrorism, it was a Japanese doomsday cult testing chemical weapons for the apocalypse they planned to trigger. Aum Shinrikyo was founded in 1984 by Chizuo Matsumoto, who later changed his name to Shoko Asahara and claimed to be the first enlightened being since Buddha. Asahara mixed Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and his own apocalyptic visions into a religion that promised followers they could achieve supernatural powers through meditation, yoga, and expensive spiritual training. What started as a small yoga studio in Tokyo grew into a billion-dollar organization with 40,000 members worldwide and facilities across Japan. Asahara was a charismatic but deeply disturbed individual who'd been nearly blind since childhood and harbored resentment against Japanese society for rejecting him. He preached that the world would end in a final war between Japan and the United States, preceded by Armageddon in 1997. Only Aum members would survive to build a new world with Asahara as their god-king. To prepare for this apocalypse, the cult stockpiled weapons, chemicals, and even attempted to acquire nuclear materials. The cult's compound at the foot of Mount Fuji became a combination monastery, weapons factory, and concentration camp. Members surrendered all possessions and lived in squalid conditions while cult leaders enjoyed luxury accommodations. Those who tried to leave were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. The cult murdered at least 29 people, including disobedient members and outside critics. Bodies were dissolved in acid or cremated in industrial furnaces installed specifically for disposing of evidence. What made Aum Shinrikyo uniquely terrifying was their scientific sophistication. The cult recruited brilliant scientists and engineers who developed chemical weapons, biological agents, and experimental drugs for mind control. They produced tons of sarin gas, experimented with anthrax and botulism, and even explored manufacturing nuclear weapons. Their stated goal was to kill millions of people and overthrow the Japanese government to install Asahara as supreme leader. The Tokyo subway attack was meant to be a trial run for larger attacks planned for later. But the botched execution cult members punctured the bags manually instead of using proper dispersal systems, limited the casualties, and led to immediate arrests. Police raids on cult facilities revealed the shocking scope of their weapons programs and plans for mass murder. They found laboratories full of chemical weapons, lists of government targets, and detailed plans for attacking major cities. Asahara and key lieutenants were arrested within months. The guru who'd promised his followers supernatural powers and immortality was found hiding in a secret room, surrounded by cash and medicine, looking nothing like the divine being he'd claimed to be. His trial lasted 8 years, during which he alternated between claiming innocence and appearing completely detached from reality. He was executed in 2018, along with 6 other cult leaders. The Aum Shinrikyo attack shattered Japan's sense of security and changed how the world viewed domestic terrorism. It proved that apocalyptic cults could acquire weapons of mass destruction and use them against innocent civilians, turning religious devotion into an instrument of mass murder. Order of the Solar Temple, Death by Fire. Between 1994 and 1997, a series of horrific murder-suicides across 3 countries shocked the world and revealed the existence of a secretive doomsday cult that promised its members transit to a new life on the star Sirius. The Order of the Solar Temple orchestrated the deaths of 74 people through elaborate rituals involving poison, gunshots, and ritualistic fires, leaving behind a mystery of mass delusion and criminal manipulation that investigators are still unraveling decades later. The Order of the Solar Temple was founded in 1984 by Luc Juret, a Belgian homeopathic physician, and Joseph D. Mambro, a French businessman with a history of fraudulent schemes. They combined New Age spirituality, Templar mythology, and apocalyptic Christianity to create a religion that attracted wealthy professionals across Europe and North America. Members believed they were reincarnated Knights Templar destined to survive an approaching environmental apocalypse and be transported to a planet orbiting Sirius. The cult operated through extreme secrecy and financial exploitation. Members paid huge sums for initiations and spiritual teachings, with some contributing their entire life savings to the organization. D. Mambro used electronic tricks to stage fake miracles during ceremonies, projecting holographic images that members believed were messages from ascended masters. The leadership lived luxuriously on members' donations while preaching about spiritual purification and the coming end of the world. As authorities began investigating the group's finances in 1994, the leaders decided to initiate their transit to Sirius. The first murders occurred in October 1994 in Switzerland and Canada. In Cherry, Switzerland, 23 members were found dead in the cult's meeting hall, arranged in a ritualistic circle and burned in a fire that consumed the building. That same night, 25 more bodies were discovered at the group's Swiss chalet, including the Dutoit family parents and their 3-month-old baby who'd been stabbed repeatedly because the child was considered the Antichrist. The murders weren't suicides but carefully orchestrated killings carried out by the cult's inner circle. Victims were drugged, shot, or suffocated before being arranged in ceremonial positions and burned. The fires were set using complex timing devices designed to ensure the buildings would be completely consumed. Investigators found that many victims had their hands bound and had been shot execution style, contradicting the cult's narrative of voluntary transit. A year later, the killing continued. In December 1995, 16 more members died in a house fire in the French Alps. The victims included entire families who'd been convinced that death was their path to spiritual advancement. Among the dead were successful professionals, including a government official, a journalist, and several business executives who'd abandoned their careers to await the apocalypse. The final tragedy occurred in March 1997, when 5 more members, including 3 children, died in a house fire in Quebec, Canada. These victims had been recruited after the previous deaths, demonstrating that even public exposure of the cult's murderous nature couldn't prevent new believers from joining what they saw as a spiritual journey to the stars. Joseph D. Mambro died in the first wave of murders, likely by suicide after orchestrating the killings. Luc Juret was also found dead in Switzerland, burned beyond recognition. Investigation revealed they'd planned the murders months in advance, creating detailed instructions for the transit and dividing members into those who would die and those who would carry out the killings before dying themselves. The Order of the Solar Temple murders exposed the international nature of modern cult operations and the ability of charismatic leaders to convince educated, successful people to abandon their lives for delusional promises of spiritual transcendence. The cult's mixture of environmental anxiety, New Age spirituality, and apocalyptic Christianity proved particularly toxic when combined with criminal leadership willing to murder dozens of followers rather than face prosecution for fraud. Heaven's Gate, waiting for the spaceship. March 26, 1997. Police in Rancho Santa Fe, California, discovered 39 bodies in a rented mansion, all wearing identical black clothing and Nike sneakers, covered with purple shrouds. Each victim had consumed a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka while believing they were shedding their earthly containers to join a spaceship hidden behind the Hale-Bopp comet. This was Heaven's Gate, a UFO cult that spent decades preparing for the most organized mass suicide in American history. Heaven's Gate was founded in the 1970s by Marshall Applewhite, a former music professor, and Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with an interest in occult spirituality. The pair, who called themselves Do and T after musical notes, preached that Earth was about to be recycled, and that salvation lay in abandoning human existence to join an alien next level of evolution. They attracted followers by combining Christian apocalypticism with science fiction mythology, claiming they were the two witnesses mentioned in the Book of Revelation. The cult's theology was bizarre even by cult standards. Members believed their human bodies were merely temporary vessels for alien souls and that through proper preparation, they could graduate to an immortal existence on a UFO. This preparation involved celibacy, androgynous appearance, and complete separation from human society. Many members underwent castration to eliminate sexual desires, viewing their human bodies as obstacles to spiritual advancement. For over 2 decades, the group lived in isolation, moving frequently and supporting themselves through web design services, ironically using the internet to fund their escape from human civilization. Members surrendered their identities, taking new names and referring to their previous lives as the world. They lived communally with rigid rules governing every aspect of daily life, from what they ate to how they cut their hair. All personal relationships were forbidden except their connection to Do and T. When Nettles died of liver cancer in 1985, Applewhite was devastated but incorporated her death into the cult's mythology, claiming she had already ascended to the next level and was preparing for the group's arrival. He became increasingly paranoid and controlling, convinced that government agents were monitoring the group and that their time on Earth was running short. The appearance of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1996 became the trigger for their final act. Applewhite convinced his followers that a spaceship was following the comet, coming to collect their souls. The group began making farewell videos, speaking calmly about their decision to exit their vehicles and join the next level. They seemed genuinely happy about their impending deaths, viewing suicide not as an end but as graduation to a higher form of existence. The mass suicide was meticulously planned. Members consumed the poison in shifts over 3 days, with survivors cleaning up after each group before taking their own doses. They packed bags as if preparing for a journey, left detailed instructions about their bodies, and maintained their website until the final moments. The last group to die included Applewhite himself, found lying peacefully with his followers in what they believed was their final moment on Earth. What made Heaven's Gate particularly disturbing was the complete dedication of its members. These weren't desperate people seeking escape from terrible lives. Many were educated professionals who'd abandoned successful careers to join the cult. Video testimonials show them speaking rationally about their decision to die, convinced they were making the ultimate spiritual evolution. Their calm acceptance of death demonstrated the terrifying power of gradual indoctrination and the human capacity for self-deception when promised transcendence from mortality. Branch Davidians, the Waco Siege. February 28, 1993. Federal agents approached a religious compound outside Waco, Texas, to serve a search warrant for illegal weapons. What should have been a routine law enforcement operation erupted into a gunfight that killed 4 agents and 6 cult members, beginning a 51-day siege that would end in one of the most controversial disasters in American law enforcement history. The Branch Davidians were an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, established at Mount Carmel outside Waco in the 1930s. For decades, they lived quietly as a small religious community focused on biblical prophecy and preparation for the Second Coming. That changed in the 1980s when Vernon Howell, later known as David Koresh, seized control of the group through a combination of charismatic preaching and violent confrontation with rival leaders. Koresh claimed to be the final prophet mentioned in the Book of Revelation, the only person capable of opening the 7 seals that would herald the apocalypse. He preached that he was divinely chosen to father a new generation of God's children through multiple wives, including underage girls. Former members reported that Koresh claimed exclusive rights to sexual relationships with all women in the community while enforcing celibacy on other men. The compound became increasingly isolated and militarized under Koresh's leadership. He stockpiled weapons and ammunition, claiming they would be needed to defend against government persecution during the end times. Former members reported harsh living conditions, with families separated and children subjected to severe discipline and potential sexual abuse. Koresh's sermons grew longer and more paranoid, sometimes lasting 8 hours as he ranted about government conspiracies and prophetic visions. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms launched their raid based on reports that the Davidians were illegally modifying firearms and suspected child abuse was occurring in the compound. The botched initial assault, possibly compromised by media coverage alerting the Davidians, led to the lengthy standoff that captivated national attention. FBI negotiators tried to convince Koresh to surrender while tactical teams surrounded the compound with armored vehicles and surveillance equipment. Inside Mount Carmel, Koresh used the siege to validate his prophecies about government persecution of God's chosen people. He alternately promised to surrender and then reneged, claiming God was giving him new instructions. Recordings reveal his increasing paranoia and grandiosity as he compared himself to Jesus Christ and prepared his followers for martyrdom. Children's voices can be heard on some tapes, adding urgency to law enforcement efforts to resolve the crisis peacefully. The siege ended catastrophically on April 19, 1993, when federal agents injected tear gas into the compound to force the inhabitants out. Instead of surrendering, the Davidians started fires throughout the building. Within minutes, the entire compound was engulfed in flames. 76 people died in the inferno, including 25 children and Koresh himself. Autopsy results revealed that some victims, including Koresh, had been shot, suggesting the deaths may not have been accidental. The Waco siege became a rallying cry for anti-government extremists and sparked intense debate about religious freedom versus law enforcement authority. Critics argued that federal agents used excessive force against a peaceful religious community, while supporters maintained that child abuse allegations and weapons violations justified intervention. The controversy deepened when investigations revealed significant tactical errors and cover-up attempts by federal agencies. Surviving Davidians maintained that Koresh was a true prophet and that the government persecution proved the validity of his teachings. The tragedy demonstrated how isolated religious communities could become dangerous when led by unstable individuals who viewed outside intervention as validation of paranoid prophecies, turning law enforcement action into the very persecution they claimed to expect. Children of God, the Family International. Behind the facade of Christian evangelism and communal living lay one of the most sexually abusive cults in modern history. The Children of God, later renamed the Family International, spent decades systematically exploiting children and using sex as a tool for recruitment and control. Founded by David Berg in the late 1960s, the group produced thousands of victims whose testimonies revealed the horrific extent of organized child abuse disguised as spiritual practice. David Berg, who called himself Moses David, and later Father David, started the Children of God as part of the Jesus movement in Southern California. Initially attracting young Christians seeking authentic spiritual experience, Berg preached a radical interpretation of Christianity that emphasized sexual freedom, communal living, and preparation for the end times. What began as hippie Christianity soon morphed into a totalitarian organization centered around Berg's increasingly bizarre sexual obsessions. Berg introduced revolutionary doctrines that justified sexual practices traditional Christianity would consider abhorrent. His law of love claimed that God's love transcended conventional morality, making any sexual act acceptable if performed with love. Flirty fishing encouraged female members to use sex to recruit new male converts, essentially turning the women into religious prostitutes. Most horrifically, Berg taught that children could express love physically with adults, providing theological justification for systematic child sexual abuse. The cult operated through communes called homes, scattered across the globe, with Berg ruling through thousands of newsletters called MO letters that detailed his visions, sexual adventures, and instructions for followers. These documents, considered divine revelation by members, contained explicit descriptions of Berg's sexual activities, including relationships with underage girls he called his wives. The letters normalized pedophilia and incest as expressions of God's love. Children born into the family faced unimaginable horrors. They were separated from parents, subjected to severe corporal punishment for minor infractions, and sexually abused by adults who claimed to be showing them God's love. Education was limited to cult literature, and children were taught that the outside world was Satan's domain. Those who questioned the abuse were punished through isolation, beating, or psychological torture designed to break their resistance. The cult's most notorious practice was sharing, where children as young as toddlers were sexually abused by multiple adults in the community. Teenage girls were forced into sexual relationships with older men and often became pregnant before age 16. Boys faced similar abuse and were taught that resistance to adult sexual advances was rebellion against God's will. International attention began focusing on the family in the 1980s and 1990s as former members spoke out about the abuse, and law enforcement agencies worldwide conducted raids on group facilities. High-profile custody cases, including one involving the son of musician Fleetwood Mac's Jeremy Spencer, exposed the group's practices to media scrutiny. However, the family's international structure and frequent relocations made prosecution difficult. Berg died in 1994, but his widow Karen Zerby continued leading the group with her second husband, Stephen Kelly. They implemented some reforms, officially banning adult-child sexual contact and restricting sharing to adults only. However, survivors reported that abuse continued in many homes despite official policy changes. The true scope of the family's crimes became clear through testimonies of second-generation survivors, children born and raised in the cult who eventually escaped as adults. Their accounts described systematic sexual abuse, forced labor, educational neglect, and psychological manipulation that destroyed thousands of lives. Many survivors struggled with addiction, mental illness, and suicide as they tried to rebuild their lives outside the only world they'd ever known. Despite rebranding itself as the Family International and claiming to have reformed, the organization continues operating worldwide with several thousand members. Former members maintain that leadership has never adequately acknowledged the extent of abuse or provided meaningful assistance to survivors. The Children of God remains one of history's most destructive cults, demonstrating how religious authority can be weaponized to justify the most heinous crimes against the most vulnerable victims. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We will love to know the country you are watching from in the comments section, and if you have any video ideas that you will love us to work on, don't hesitate to drop it in the comments section. See you soon in our next videos.